Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to our webinar, Using Litigation to Increase PE Policy Compliance in California, Impact and Unintended Consequences. I'm Erin Hagan, the Deputy Director for Evidence for Action, or E4A, and I'll be your moderator today. E4A is a national program of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation committed to developing the evidence base to align with RWJF's vision of building a culture of health across America. Our mission at E4A is to support rigorous research examining which strategies are most effective in improving population health, well-being, and health equity. Today we're talking about one of the tools advocates have at their disposal for exacting change, litigation. In the case of the research we're highlighting today, we'll be looking specifically at the impacts of using litigation as a policy enforcement method for minimum physical education requirements in California. Both the National Academy of Sciences and the American Heart Association, among others, recommend that schools play a central role in preventing childhood obesity by increasing physical activity and fitness levels through different strategies, including physical education. Providing physical education in public schools is one way to ensure that all students have the opportunity to be physically active in a safe environment. And such physical activity in schools has been demonstrated to improve physical health, academic performance, and mental health. As our speakers will share, the state of California passed a law requiring that schools provide a certain amount of physical education time. But compliance with the policy has been low, and there was no clear mechanism for enforcement, which led to a suit against many California school districts. During the webinar, we'll learn about the impacts and consequences of this suit were on these and other school districts in the state, and hear recommendations for other strategies for improving compliance with the law in the future. Our speakers today are Drs. Kristine Madsen and Hannah Thompson, both of the University of California, Berkeley School of Public Health. Dr. Madsen is an associate professor and Dr. Thompson is a research scientist. Their research focuses on school and community-based methods to increase physical activity levels with the goals of improving youth health and decreasing obesity and health disparities. We're also joined by Karen Johnson of Shape America, a National Society of Health and Physical Educators committed to ensuring all children have the opportunity to lead healthy, physically active lives. Karen will share an advocacy perspective regarding how findings from this study could impact PE standards and compliance on a national level beyond California. Prior to her work at Shape, Ms. Johnson served as Assistant Secretary of Education for Legislation and Congressional Affairs and acted as a key advisor to Secretary of Education Rod Page, providing strategic counsel on legislative, political, and communications issues. She has extensive experience in the policy landscape, campaign work, and communications, and we're happy to have all of our speakers here today to share their expertise with us. Let me turn now to Hannah to kick us off.
Great. Thank you so much, Erin. I'm sorry, just figuring out how to advance these slides here. Okay, so before we begin, I just wanted to acknowledge our research team that worked with us on the study, Bonnie Singh and Annie Reed from UC Berkeley, Robert Garcia from the City Project down in LA, Monica Lounsbury from Cal State Long Beach, and Ben Winnig from Change Lab Solutions in Oakland. So it's no surprise to anybody on this call, Erin gave a nice introduction that moderate-to-vigorous physical activity, or MVPA, which is that health-enhancing physical activity, is incredibly important for the health of both youth and adults. And this, when we talk about moderate-to-vigorous physical activity, or MVPA, what we're really talking about is physical activity that gets your heart beating faster, that gets you sweating, and that also gets you breathing harder. So the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Physical Activity Guidelines for Americans recommends that kids should get at least 60 minutes of this health-enhancing MVPA every day. And just a few years ago, the Institute of Medicine came out with an additional recommendation that students should actually be getting 60 minutes of MVPA during the school day, which really highlights the vital role schools can play in students' physical activity and their health. In-school physical education class, or PE, provides the greatest opportunity for students to accrue MVPA during the school day. So why PE? PE has been identified as the most important but underused public health tool to increase youth physical activities and also improve health. It's one of the most effective and equitable ways to get all kids active and healthier, regardless of their sex, their race, ethnicity, or their socioeconomic status. And this is because PE can affect virtually all children for most of their school careers. PE also affords kids the opportunity to learn the skills that are necessary to be physically active later in life. So the basic movement skills, like those you develop in PE, form the foundation of almost all later sporting and physical activities. And research shows that kids who learn these skills and are competent in them now are more likely to be active later in life. So PE really has the potential to influence the next generation to be healthier and more active. So while there's no federal education law that mandates how much PE students should get, the Society for Health and Physical Educators, or SHAPE America, which is the country's leading PE organization, and you'll hear from Karen Johnson from SHAPE America shortly, they recommend that at the elementary level, students get the equivalent of 30 minutes of PE a day. In California, however, the number of minutes of PE students should receive has actually been legislated. It's not just a recommendation here. So in California, the mandate in elementary schools is the equivalent of 20 minutes a day. But even though we have a law, and even though our law is for fewer minutes than what is recommended nationally by SHAPE America, we know that unfortunately PE is just not happening. In fact, fewer than 1 in 5 fifth graders in California attend school in a district that actually meets the PE mandate of 20 minutes a day. And there are over 3 million public elementary students in California. So figuring out how to increase compliance with the PE law actually can have a significant public health impact. And most research attempts to improve PE have really focused on how to increase student MVPA levels when they're in PE class, which is obviously very important, but the first step really is to ensure that PE is happening in the first place, and particularly in states that have PE laws in place, ensuring that schools are complying with the law. So one relatively newly attempted approach to increasing compliance with PE law is litigation. And in 2013, a California lawyer tried just that. He filed a lawsuit against 37 school districts in California for being non-compliant with the elementary PE law. And the lawsuit settled with the lawyer making an estimated $1.2 million that school districts had to pay directly to him and lawyers' fees. And the districts also had to pay additional money to cover fees for their own lawyers. So this, from the public's perspective, and at least how it was covered in the popular press, was a pretty controversial approach. Yet it was lauded by some public health and law advocacy organizations for upholding the law and for promoting more PE in schools. So as part of the lawsuit settlement requirements, elementary teachers in the 37 districts now have to teach the mandated PE minutes, track and report PE minutes to the district, make their PE schedules publicly available. Principals have to do spot checks of PE schedules and report if and why PE was missed and when it will be made up, as well as report PE schedules to the school board. And it's important to note that these settlement requirements essentially support existing policy that requires that the California Department of Education track PE minutes that are happening in schools. And as somebody who's been studying PE for a long time and trying to research ways to improve PE in schools, I was really interested in understanding the impact of this lawsuit. Was it a good thing or was it a bad thing? And is this an approach that should be tried in other states where there are PE laws? So the objectives of our study were to better understand the impact of the lawsuit on PE minutes, to understand how easy or difficult it has been to fulfill the settlement requirements, and then also the potential unintended consequences. So anecdotally, before we did the study, we heard a lot of negative feedback from school districts about the lawsuits. People were pretty angry about it. So we wanted to understand if there were potentially unintended consequences of a legal approach. Could this sour teachers further as far as PE is concerned? And PE, as we all know, is a subject that already faces considerable barriers to successful implementation. So we decided to take a qualitative approach with this study because we really wanted to understand people's perceptions of the lawsuit. We conducted 97 interviews in a sample of districts and schools that were involved in the lawsuit, as well as in demographically matched control districts and schools that were not parties in the lawsuit. And we wanted to include a control group because we were interested in understanding if the threat of litigation might be impactful. And we intentionally sampled school districts and schools that had a high percentage of students who qualified for free or reduced price meals, which we know is a good proxy for socioeconomic status and race ethnicity. So our final sample included interviews from 14 lawsuit districts and 14 lawsuit schools, and 15 control districts and 25 controlled schools. And of these interviewees, we spoke to district-level administrators, 15 from lawsuit schools and 15 from lawsuit districts and 13 from control districts. School principals, 9 from lawsuit schools and 16 from controls. 5th grade classroom teachers, 11 from lawsuit schools and 23 from controls. And we spoke to 5th grade classroom teachers specifically because 5th grade is the grade in California where students have to take the state-mandated fitness test. And we also spoke to PE teachers, 7 from lawsuit schools and 4 from controls. And all interviews were recorded and professionally transcribed, and then we double-coded the data looking for themes using in vivo qualitative software. And here's what we found. So according to interviewees in lawsuit districts and schools, PE minutes have increased. Overwhelmingly, people believe that the lawsuit has positively impacted PE in California elementary schools. And the fear of being sued has also reportedly increased PE minutes in control districts. And tracking and reporting PE minutes increases accountability. So the primary mechanism for this reported increase in PE minutes was the lawsuit settlement requirement mandating teachers track and report their PE minutes, which interviewees believed increased accountability for PE. We also found that personnel reportedly increased in lawsuit districts. More than half of lawsuit districts reported hiring somebody new or appointing an existing employee to oversee PE implementation at the district level. However, only a quarter of districts actually hired additional PE teachers. So only about 4 districts hired new PE teachers. And the vast majority of interviewees still believe that the number one thing that could be done to increase PE law compliance was to hire more PE teachers. An unwillingness to participate in research was the primary unintended consequence of the lawsuit. So personnel in schools that were parties to the lawsuit were significantly less willing than controls to participate in this study, citing fears that data collected could highlight noncompliance and lead to being sued again. And this poses a problem not only in that being unwilling to participate in research hinders scientific progress, but perhaps more importantly, it actually stymies potential collaboration on work to improve PE. But contrary to our original hypothesis that the lawsuit could sour teachers and schools on PE, we found that most personnel actually felt relieved and that the lawsuit gave them the freedom and justification to actually go out and teach PE. So this study was, of course, not without limitations, the primary being a lack of objective data on PE policy compliance before the lawsuit, which precluded us from taking a pre-post approach. We relied on self-reported data, which are prone to social desirability and recall bias, and responses could overstate how much PE is actually happening. Also, participation bias could impact the generalizability of these results if those who agreed to participate were more interested in PE or have stronger feelings about the lawsuit than those who declined. And because of the limitations of self-reported data, our next research step is to quantitatively verify these findings by examining difference in changes in students' fitness scores between students that attended schools that were parties to the lawsuit and in control schools that were not involved with the lawsuit. So we're excited to move on with this research and work on that next. So in conclusion, litigation may be a useful tool to increase compliance with PE policy. In this case, what litigation did, what this lawsuit did, was it gave the law teeth. It created a penalty for noncompliance where one did not exist before. But litigation is resource intensive, and it's really hard to walk away from this work saying that everybody should just go around suing noncompliant school districts. Instead, there needs to be accountability for PE, including supported systems for tracking and reporting PE minutes. So the real question is, how do we actually hold schools accountable? And I believe that this starts with the California Department of Education. They need to provide support for schools and districts to track and report PE minutes, including training, dedicated personnel time both in districts and at the state level, as well as technologies like smartphone apps to increase the efficiency and accuracy of reporting. And so setting up these sorts of systems now would be far likely be more effective in the long run than having additional lawsuits. So here are some of the next steps that we came up with to improve PE law compliance. The first being relatively obvious, but that is to actually provide financial support for PE, specifically for PE teachers, for evidence-based curriculum, and for professional development for classroom teachers who are most likely to be charged with teaching PE at elementary schools in California. And this could be accomplished by taking advantage of the new ability to allocate existing Title I and Title II federal funding for PE through the new federal Every Student Succeeds Act. So appropriating additional funding for PE would demonstrate commitment to student health at both the state and the federal levels. Here in California, we could mandate the inclusion of PE tracking, reporting, and budgeting in districts' annual local control accountability plans, or LCAPs, which are yearly district-level plans for education programming and budgeting, which are mandated by the state. And because California's new LCAPs must include plans for assessing outcomes, this could actually help increase accountability for PE, especially if noncompliance is tied to financial incentives or penalties, such as loss of district funding. Again, we need to provide support for districts and schools to track and report PE minutes, including trainings and technologies like smartphone apps to increase the efficiency and accuracy of reporting. And the California Department of Education should invest in more meaningful PE audits. They need to commit personnel time within the CDE to track the PE minutes collected by districts and also to truly hold districts and schools accountable for noncompliance. So for example, PE could be built into the accountability requirements for the new local control funding formula. And finally, we need to increase awareness about the importance of PE for administrators, teachers, and parents. So while most personnel we talk to genuinely appreciate the value of PE, the pressure to focus on academic subjects still poses limitations on their ability to teach the subject. So working to ensure priority for and the implementation of PE is on par with that of traditional academic subjects is still necessary. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hannah. This was so informative and such a great overview. And we'll come back with a few questions towards the end. And I just want to remind and encourage our participants who may have questions to type your questions into the chat feature on the side of the webinar panel, and we'll get to those after we hear from Karen. So Karen, let's turn to you now to share with us a little bit about how this work in California applies outside the state, perhaps at the national level or at the state level in other parts of the country, and how this research can really be translated into advocacy and action.
Yeah, that was a very interesting overview of the litigation and the research. Shape America, which is a national organization representing health and physical education educators for over 30 years, has worked to compile a study called Shape of the Nation. And their partners on this study include the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the American Heart Association. And it gives really a snapshot of what health and physical education look like in American schools. The last Shape of the Nation report was issued in 2016. And in 2016, we found that while nearly every state had health and physical education standards, actually few of them implemented those standards. Most states, 62% of them, allowed for waivers, exemptions, substitutions for physical education. And actually, a handful of them actually used physical education, withholding physical education as a form of punishment for kids. So while schools and districts talk about standards, they don't always implement those standards. Actually, only D.C. and Oregon that meet the Shape America standards for physical education and health education. Additionally, what we've learned is that the median physical education budget for schools in the United States is only $764 per school per year, which is an incredibly low investment considering how vital physical education is to our youth, not only now but in the future. It provides life skills and a foundation for healthy living that will last a lifetime. Shape America, along with other organizations, including the American Heart Association, about a decade ago worked to elevate health and physical education within federal education law, and Hannah touched on that a little bit. Under No Child Left Behind, both subjects were left out of the definition of a core academic subject, which meant that they were not eligible for federal funding, Title I, Title II in particular. Physical education had what many of you may recall was the PEP grant, the Physical Education Program grant. That funding fluctuated from 2002 until 2016 when the last grants were awarded. It went from $100 million to $47 million. So Shape America, along with nearly 100 other organizations, worked very hard, like I said, to elevate health and PE within federal education law. So now both subjects are part of the definition of a well-rounded education, which means that they are eligible for funding within Title I, Title II, and also Title IV. And Title IV has two parts. One is Title IV Part A, which is it's a grant program that should flow by formula to the states and the districts. But for 2017, it's a little different because Congress didn't really get their funding act together. But then there's also Title IV Part B, which is 21st Century Community Learning Centers. Those are the after-school and out-of-school programs, which in ESSA put an emphasis on health and physical education. So as districts and principals and educators look for funds, there are federal funds available for both health and physical education. And I'm happy to answer any questions on that, especially the Title IV Part A, which is not only new but somewhat confusing given the funding structure for STEP 2017.
Great. Thank you, Karen. So I think we'll, again, remind people if they do have questions to go ahead and type them into the chat function. And we have a handful that we have in advance, so we'll go ahead and turn to those. And I have a few questions for all of our speakers. So let's just start at the high-level overview of this using litigation to enforce the PE policy here in California. And either Hannah or Chris, is your sense that it has done more good than harm, or what have the sort of trade-offs been, and what is sort of the overall grade of using litigation in this case?
Hi, this is Chris. So, contrary to our hypothesis, we really felt that litigation was not a good thing in the school setting given the resources that it might take up. But I have to say, after completing this study and another study that we're concurrently working on, I think it's actually very effective. And while it's not ideal, and Hannah was talking earlier about, is there a way to hold schools accountable to put teeth in these laws without actually resorting to litigation? Until we find those approaches, this may be the most effective way to get schools to actually do what they need to do. And I'll just say anecdotally, in this concurrent study that we're doing, we were talking to our team this morning and just heard that in a completely separate study, not involving any of the schools that were involved in the litigation, but tracking their progress in PE over time, our team noticed a big jump in what people were reporting in terms of feeling that they were held accountable, teachers feeling that they were held accountable for PE. And I doubt that reflects much else besides the lawsuit. It's very well known that there's this lawsuit happening, even among districts that weren't involved. And I think that they worry about their pocketbook. They worry about being involved in something that's actually legally binding. And that's an impetus that I don't know that we can mimic that with any other accountability procedure, frankly.
Yes, and interestingly enough, sometimes litigation is set up, especially when you're talking about city departments, sometimes litigation is set up as the only method for enforcement. And in fact, there are cases where local laws or charters or policies, more institutional policies, really limit action that can be taken outside of litigation, interestingly enough. Karen, let me ask you from your perspective in other parts of the country, and then Chris, you're welcome to follow up as well after, but just if you've seen this approach in other states, and if so, if you've experienced similar responses and outcomes related to litigation in other states.
I have to be very candid. I actually have not. That doesn't mean that it hasn't happened. It just means that I'm not aware, or it didn't reach the level of media attention that California's lawsuit did.
Sure. And Chris and Hannah, I know you mentioned that there are many recommendations across the country, but California has actually put into place a law. Are there laws in other states, or are we really just looking at California as the only state that currently has the law?
Oh, I'm guessing Karen actually has those numbers at the tips of her fingers, but there are definitely other states where it's a law. There are other states where it's a recommendation, but there are definitely states that have a law mandating a minimum number of minutes.
Yeah, all 50 states and territories have some sort of physical education standard. And as I mentioned, they may have it as a law, but then they have loopholes and waivers. 62% of the states provide waivers. So let's say that a student is in band. They get a waiver for physical education. There's any number of instances where a student can get a waiver and not participate in physical education.
Interesting. And it sounds like there might not be a high consistency or high standards for what would qualify to provide that waiver, or maybe even that PE is not considered as a physical activity so much as an extracurricular, and so you're able to swap out other extracurriculars that may or may not be very physically active.
Right, and that was one of our arguments. Again, I mentioned that we worked for a decade to elevate health and physical education within federal education law because, as everyone on this webinar knows, messaging is everything. And leaving health and physical education out of that definition of core academic subjects made both health and physical education substandard subjects in the eyes of many administrators. And it was incredibly important for us, not only for the flow of federal funds, but the notoriety and the importance of being in that definition now of a well-rounded education. And I also, just one point where I think Congress got it right with ESSA, and that was shifting the focus from core academic subjects to well-rounded, recognizing really for the first time that a student's school day, a student's school career encompasses much more than, teaching to the test. And we were very pleased with the definition of well-rounded and the shift to the focus around well-rounded education.
Absolutely.
And Karen, one question I have, so this is Chris again. Hannah just pulled up, I think this actually comes from your study, the SHAPE study, but there are 19 states that mandate a minimum number of PE minutes.
Right.
And as you note, all 50 states have something on the books, but there are 19 that actually have education law. So if we, and we all know that almost none of them probably comply adequately. So one of the problems for us is figuring out where to target efforts because there's so few data available on implementation levels. So, which states have the worst state of PE right now? Where should we go first? Which is the state to go to say you might actually, and this is not, as a private citizen, maybe I would say legislation or litigation may actually be effective for this particular state. Not that I think that that's the intervention that should always be used, but how do we even know which states need the most help?
Well, on the if you link to the Shape America, Shape of the Nation page, there's a breakdown. There's a page on every single state. But I can tell you that the overwhelming majority of the states only meet half of the criteria that we've proposed, and that in terms of who are the bad actors here and who need a little more education, Arizona, Arkansas, Idaho, Kentucky, Nebraska, Nevada, Texas, and Utah. They need to pick it up a little bit.
There you go.
So let me ask to this point about well-rounded and also these states that should be picking it up. Do any of the standards reference quality or have definitions for quality? Or right now are we really just looking at the number of minutes spent in PE? And do we have any sense of whether that time in PE is equivalent across schools who are meeting the same standards of minutes?
Right. So it is state by state. About half of the states have policy that require some type of student assessment. And there's also, a lot of the states will also require that physical education teachers meet state profession requirements. But that also varies by elementary, middle, and high school levels. So it's a mixed bag. In terms of well-rounded, we are simply included in that definition. There are no guidelines for physical education or health education in federal education law. It's just an allowable use of federal funds and a recognition that these subjects should be included as part of a student's well-rounded education.
Chris, did you want to add to this?
This is Hannah. And one of the general recommendations that we often use is that students should be spending half of PE class time in moderate to vigorous physical activity or MVPA, and that's different from something like recess or classroom game break, which is really supposed to be focused purely on physical activity accrual. In physical education, as Karen was alluding to, there are in many states model content standards. Like here in California, you're supposed to, progress through at a certain, you're supposed to learn how to jump, you're supposed to learn to skip, to execute an overhand throw, things like that. So there are standards in some states too, but the quality marker that we often look at is how much physical activity students are getting during class, and we've seen incredible variability in that across grade levels and across school types and also by gender. We see in the elementary levels, boys and girls typically get similar amounts of physical activity during class, but then as they get older, we see a precipitous drop-off for girls where they're participating less than boys are and getting less physical activity in class.
And so in your research, Hannah, are you able to sort of suss out the levels of quality across the schools and whether or not quality also improved, or primarily at this point we know that compliance improved in terms of the number of minutes that were being spent or at least being tracked?
Yeah, so that's a question that we asked as part of our interviews, and most people said that PE quality actually has not improved because of the lawsuit, and that's because there was not additional funding for PE because of the lawsuit. So a lot of districts, one of my favorite quotes was, well, you have to take money from Peter to pay Paul. So if you want PE, the money came from music or it came from other places in order to get increase PE teachers or to increase something else. So most people did not believe that class quality actually improved, and if quality was going to improve, there needed to be a significant financial investment either in credentialed PE teachers who are qualified and trained to teach PE, or in trainings and evidence-based curriculum for classroom teachers to use so that they actually had the skills and knowledge to teach it effectively.
So, Chris, you mentioned just a minute ago in one of your answers that litigation may not always be the right tool to use, and I think probably most people would agree with that. But do you have anything to share in terms of criteria or characteristics of a situation or an environment where litigation might be the best approach, or one of a strong strategy, a component of a strong strategy that would be effective?
Well, it's interesting. I think, when Karen was pointing out that we can on their website sort of find those states that seem to be least compliant, those are certainly the places where I would think about potentially using that strategy, because they've got such a distance to go, and they clearly are sort of thwarting the law. They're what they're doing is actually a violation of the law. And over and over, this is one of the things that came up is this lawsuit was really just trying to get schools to comply with existing law. It's not actually exacting anything more from the schools than what's required, either specifically through the PE law or through the policy about the CDE monitoring what's happening with PE. So first, I think identifying those states that seem to be having where kids are the least served, right, where the kids are not getting what they're supposed to be getting. And then I think the other thing, as with any particular intervention, is where do you have partners who might be willing to take something like this on? This is not, the lawyer who did these lawsuits was vilified by many, including, honestly, us initially. We were, really distressed to see this happening again for those reasons about, where are the resources from schools best used, and is this really a good use of their time and money? So I think if you find states that have a need where kids are really not being served, and you find a partner who's willing to take something like this on, someone who's willing to actually close a lawsuit, those are the places, those are the types of readiness things I would be looking for.
Excellent.
And I also think it's important to note that he was vilified because he won this $1.2 million settlement. And as part of the settlement, he said, I'm going to be taking some of this money and giving it back to the schools or investing in PE, which we have yet to see happen. And so I think that, too, a lawsuit could also potentially be much more successful in Chris's sense of it being more grassroots and being with partners, something like Robert Garcia's organization, the City Project down in LA, where if they took money from schools, they took their money from the settlement and then invested it back in schools or set up some sort of fund to pay for PE teachers or training. I think that would be by far the most effective way to work something like this.
Yeah, especially given that one of the recommendations is the need to have these be funded as opposed to unfunded mandates that are, and that one of the big challenges is having resources available to districts and PE teachers to really implement these requirements.
Exactly.
So, Karen, I want to come to you, and again, Chris and Hannah, feel free to jump in as well, and touch on this point that Hannah actually mentioned early on in the presentation about the fact that we actually do have quite a bit of research that demonstrates that physical activity does lead to improved academic outcomes, but we still hear this same argument against implementing more PE, which is the need to teach to the test and the fear that PE will detract from academic focus. And so my question for you is, how do we better translate this research into advocacy, into policy, and into better understanding? How do we make this research resonate with people who are still really unconvinced that that these are mutually beneficial, not mutually exclusive paths?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's something that we, again, have been working on for about 10 years. And the research, 10 years ago, we didn't have the research that we have now. And we can go into a member of Congress's office, meet with his staff, meet with staff at the various state departments of education, and actually provide them with the research. We can also point out to individuals that we meet with, anecdotally, do you run every morning? Do you take a walk every morning? Do you go to the gym every morning? We try to put them in the student's shoes. And what if you were sitting at a desk for 8 hours a day without a break, or with just a break between class and class? Like, how would you do your job? People get it. I think that it's going to take a collective effort on all of our parts to really have conversations with policymakers, but also with administrators, that if they want to see better outcomes, they need to include physical education, and not just recess, but physical education, where the kids are challenging their minds as well as their bodies. We've got some really interesting partners that have joined us in this. You all may know an organization called Mission Readiness. Mission Readiness is made up of retired military brass, for lack of a better word, and they got engaged in the obesity crisis around the Childhood Nutrition Act. And they issued a report called Too Fat to Fight, because obesity and the lack of health literacy and physical education is now impacting our national defense and our first responders. They've picked up some of the research, and they speak to the same audiences that we do, but from a different vantage point. So I really do think it is a collective effort in educating individuals that are making these decisions. And parents. Parents are not aware that their kids aren't getting physical education.
I completely agree with you about this need to tell stories with our data, and have so many examples where people have shared about how they come in and talk about the numbers and how many thousands or hundreds of thousands of lives they've saved with big campaigns, and it doesn't even elicit the same response as one person's compelling life story. So I think this idea of making data resonate to people through stories and through personal anecdotes is so much more compelling. To this point about parents, I totally agree. That is an audience or a group of people to really engage in this effort, because they have a vested interest in their children's health, and they have the direct line of communication with the schools. So Hannah or Chris, do you have a sense, or have you spoken with any parents about their perceptions of the lawsuit? Have you worked with any parent groups, PTOs, to help disseminate this information and garner their voices into this effort?
That's a great question, and we actually came to that point ourselves, but unfortunately just a little bit too late logistically. So we amended our study protocol to include the heads of PTAs and all of the schools and districts that were part of the study. But unfortunately, by the time we were able to get it through our IRB, most school PTAs and district PTAs turn over in May, at the end of the school year, May or June, so we weren't actually able to get enough people to participate to get their opinions. But I think that moving forward and doing this type of work, the parent voice is incredibly important, and I think in a lot of the interviews that absolutely came out, especially with with school principals in particular saying, well, this is something our parents really do care about, or this is something that our parents don't particularly care about, and how influential that is on, what parents' opinions, parents driving things, how much that does influence what's happening in individual school environments.
So to this point about, some of the next steps, I know you mentioned a little bit about the quantitative aspect that you're looking at embarking on and some of the advocacy points. Actually, if we could just sort of go around to each of you, and if you could talk about the most important next steps for translating this research, for building upon this research, and for really impacting change. Hannah,
I do think, sorry, Karen, go ahead.
Sorry, it was Erin. I just was asking Hannah if you would start for us.
Oh, sure. Sorry, no problem. Yeah, so I do think that doing some quantitative verification, so really looking at changes in student fitness scores is a really important next step in looking at litigation specifically, but in sort of translating what we learned from this study, the biggest lesson being that accountability truly matters and that we need better accountability systems and PE minute tracking and reporting systems. So what I would love to do, and we've talked about this, is figuring out pilot testing some sort of app or integrating PE tracking into already existing school apps where parents can interface with the app and kind of see what's happening in the classroom. I think that testing that would be really important. And I actually spoke with somebody after we had finished our study. I kind of wanted to run our findings by people who were not in our study to kind of get their opinions. So if we come out and say X, Y, and Z, does this sound ridiculous or does this sound reasonable? And someone in a district that I spoke to said she loved the idea of having kids actually be the one who are responsible for tracking PE minutes. So if you have sort of, your classroom iPad or your classroom tablet and there's a class dojo and they're in charge of, tapping into PE and tapping out of PE. So kind of involving the students more in that accountability piece could be another really good way to integrate this and something that's relatively inexpensive since most teachers do have smartphones these days.
Great. Yeah, that I'm sure there's a lot of interesting solutions and ideas out there that would engage technology and kids sort of checking in and even some of game theory. So that's a really interesting idea to engage students in this as well. Chris, what are your thoughts on sort of the most pressing next steps?
Well, it's all related to accountability, but I think on the flip side of that is trying to engage the departments of education at the state level, because the schools sending their information up, right? That's what Hannah's talking about, is a way to make sure that schools are actually registering when PE is and isn't happening and registering their schedules. And that's valuable as long as the CDE is then monitoring that in some way. So, and CDE, of course, I'm talking about the California Department of Education, but every state has its own Department of Education. So can we convene, the Departments of Education in some way to encourage greater engagement in, the importance of the critical importance of PE? And so I think that's one piece. And then the other is, I do think it would be interesting to talk to those states that are least, serving their students most poorly at this point, and see if there are partners that might be interested in litigation, just in terms of translating the actual research to other platforms. That, I think, would be a really interesting approach.
And Hannah, let me just follow up quickly before I turn to Karen on this last point. I know you all have a number of partners who you worked with on this project who may be good resources, but just wondering for advocates or parents or who are in these other states who may not have legal resources immediately available, are there any resources you can share with people about how to reach out or engage, if they are interested in litigation, engage with the right legal services?
I mean, I think Robert Garcia's organization, the City Project, which is down in LA, would be a great place to start. They've been working on PE for 10 or 15 years, and they've worked with the Los Angeles Department of Public Health, Los Angeles, of course, being the largest school district in the state, and I think actually the country. I can't remember LA, USD is bigger, and New York is bigger. But and so they've done a tremendous amount of work, and they've developed some toolkits for helping schools track and report PE minutes, ensuring that they're in compliance with the law. So they have some great tools, and he'd be a great person to reach out to in terms of figuring out if you wanted to translate this bring this into other states.
Great, thank you. So Karen, let me turn to you then to share your thinking around the most important next steps that we could take building off of this research and this and these findings.
I think I would take the research and the findings and share with parents and school administrators, but then include the fact that there's now federal funding for health and physical education. A lot of school administrators don't realize that, and the new Title IV Part A actually allows for technology. So physical education is one of the few subjects where you can use one of the three buckets that program is divided into. It's well-rounded, safe and healthy schools, and then technology. So if you're looking for a smartphone app or some other type of way of tracking students, their performance or how many hours they're logging in PE, there's money for it now through this new title.
Great. Yes. So critically important for people to know about that that funding availability, and I do think in previous conversations we've talked about the fact that it might not be well known that this is an available source of funding, and so helping to let your local school districts know that this is available for that use is a really important next step. So let me just open up before we are approaching the top of the hour. We have a couple more minutes, so let me open up and see if there's anything that any of the three of you wanted to add before we wrap up. Last thoughts, to last parting thoughts for our participants.
This is Chris. The one thing I would say is I think over my period of time working with PE, I've often heard advocates talk about the importance of PE in academic performance. And I just want to be clear that it is true, absolutely, that a kid who is healthy is a better learner, and that no one questions that. But I think, PE is important for many, many reasons, independent of academic performance. And I just don't want PE to be held to a higher standard in some ways, that it's supposed to do everything. PE is a critical piece, and I think ESSA, as Karen has been saying, is really sort of a new era for schools, allowing them to focus on PE for PE's sake.
Well put. Hannah or Karen? Yep.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that a little bit, that's a very good point. PE in its all-encompassing area of subject matter includes things like conflict resolution and social and emotional learning. So physical education is, like we always say, it's much more than just dodgeball.
Absolutely. Although dodgeball can be fun too.
Yes, especially the movie.
Hannah, last words?
No, I think the last thing I would just say is I do feel fortunate, that RWJF funded this work. I think for a long time PE has just been such an underdog, and has, there's the famous Woody Allen quote, those who, I can't even remember now, but something it ends with, those who can't teach physical education. But I do believe that the tide is turning, and I think with the new changes to ESSA, and I think kind of more of a national culture towards recognizing the importance of physical activity and nutrition, especially with all the work that Michelle Obama did. I do believe that we are heading in the right direction. We just need to make sure that we keep this momentum up and keep, having good people and good organizations like Shape America doing this sort of advocacy work, and schools keep sort of pushing on PE to really help ensure the health of their kids.
Absolutely. Such great words to leave us with. So I do want to go ahead and wrap us up. I want to thank the three of you, Chris, Hannah, and Karen, for joining us today. Really dynamic conversation and information that you've shared with us. For our participants, I want to share with you all the various ways you can contact Evidence for Action, be in touch with us, and in particular our website where you can learn more about this research as well as the other grants that we have funded that are doing equally as interesting and impressive research to help build a culture of health. So thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to engaging with you in the future.
Thank you all.